The morning sun cast long shadows across Wagadugu as President Ibrahim Traoré's convoy moved through the familiar streets of Burkina Faso's capital. The armored vehicles moved with practiced precision, their occupants alert to every corner, every face in the crowd. Inside the lead vehicle, Ibrahim sat in contemplative silence, his mind still processing the intense security briefing that had consumed the previous 3 hours. The meeting had been troubling. Intelligence reports spoke of growing unrest in the northern provinces, whispers of coup attempts, and the ever-present threat of terrorism that plagued the Sahel region. At 34, Ibrahim had already survived more political storms than most leaders twice his age. The weight of leading a nation caught between tradition and modernity, between hope and desperation, pressed heavily on his shoulders. As the convoy approached the usual route back to the presidential palace, something stirred within him, an inexplicable urge that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The intersection ahead offered 2 paths: the secure, well-traveled route that his security detail had mapped and cleared, or the old cemetery road that wound past the Dagnoan burial ground, a place where the city's forgotten rested beneath weathered headstones and sparse shade trees. "Turn left," Ibrahim said suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning quiet. His driver, Captain Wagadugu, a veteran of 15 years in presidential security, glanced in the rearview mirror with concern. "Sir, that's not our designated route. The cemetery road hasn't been swept for security today." Ibrahim felt the pull stronger now, as if an invisible hand were guiding his decision. "I know, Captain. Take the cemetery road anyway." "Mr. President, with respect, that area is unsecured. We haven't established a perimeter and—" "Just do it," Ibrahim interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. Sometimes a leader must follow his instincts, even when they don't make tactical sense. Captain Wagadugu exchanged worried glances with the security chief riding in the passenger seat, but years of service had taught him when to argue and when to obey. The convoy took the unexpected turn, radio chatter immediately buzzing between the vehicles as security protocols shifted to accommodate the unplanned route change. The cemetery road was narrower than the main thoroughfares, lined with ancient baobab trees, whose massive trunks had witnessed generations of Burkina history. The graves stretched out on both sides, some marked with elaborate monuments, others with simple stones, many forgotten entirely. It was here, among the silent testimonies of lives lived and lost, that Ibrahim's eyes caught something that would change everything. Beside a modest grave marked by a weathered headstone sat a small figure, a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, her small frame draped in a torn yellow dress that had once been bright but now bore the stains of dust and time. Her feet were bare, caked in the red earth that characterized this region. In her hands she held a piece of torn cloth, gently wiping the surface of the tombstone with the careful attention of someone performing a sacred ritual. There was something about the scene that pierced through Ibrahim's presidential armor. The dignity in her movements, the solemnity of her task, the profound loneliness that seemed to emanate from her small form. She moved with the measured care that someone who understood loss in ways that most adults never would. "Stop the car," Ibrahim commanded. The security chief turned sharply. "Sir, we cannot stop. This area is not secure. We need to return to—" "Stop the car," Ibrahim repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made his decision. "Now." The convoy came to a halt, engines idling as security personnel immediately began scanning the surroundings. Radio chatter intensified as the team worked to establish an impromptu security perimeter around the unplanned stop, But Ibrahim's attention was entirely focused on the small figure by the grave, who had not yet noticed the arrival of the presidential motor car. Captain Sawadogo stepped first, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm as he surveyed the area. "Mr. President, please remain in the vehicle until we can secure the perimeter." But Ibrahim was already opening his door. The morning air hit him, dry and carrying the scent of dust and the faint fragrance of wildflowers that grew among the graves. His security detail moved into position around him, creating a protective formation that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. As the president approached, the girl finally looked up. Her eyes were remarkable, large, dark, and holding depths that seemed impossible for someone so young. There was no fear in her gaze when she saw the armed men and the official vehicles. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity, as if she were simply observing another detail in a world that had already shown her too much. "What's your name?" Ibrahim asked, softly, kneeling down to bring himself to her eye level. His security team remained tense, their training screaming at them to move their principal away from this uncontrolled situation, but something in the president's manner kept them at bay. "Divine," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear as crystal. She didn't lower her eyes or shrink away. Instead, she continued to study this man who had suddenly appeared in her solitary world. "Divine?" Ibrahim repeated, the name feeling significant on his tongue. "That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me about this grave?" The girl's gaze returned to the headstone, her small hand still clutching the piece of cloth. "My mama and papa," she said simply. "They died in a fire. Our house burned down 6 months ago." Ibrahim felt something tighten in his chest. He had dealt with national tragedies, statistics of loss and displacement, but here was tragedy distilled into one small person, sitting alone among the dead, with a dignity that shamed the chaos of the political world he inhabited daily. "Where do you live now?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "Here," Divine said, gesturing to the cemetery around them. "The villagers said I was cursed because I survived when my parents didn't. They said I brought bad luck, so I stayed here with Mama and Papa." The words hit Ibrahim like a physical blow. This child, this small, brave child, had been living among the graves for 6 months, surviving on whatever scraps she could find, maintaining the dignity of her parents' memory while the world turned its back on her. Captain Sawadogo appeared at Ibrahim's shoulder. "Sir, we really need to move. We're exposed here," and Ibrahim stood, his decision already made. "Call the Social Services Department immediately. I want a full team here within the hour." He looked down at Divine, who was watching this exchange with those impossibly mature eyes. "And I want her brought to the palace before sundown." "Sir?" Captain Sawadogo's voice carried barely contained alarm. "A child from the streets? The security implications alone are my responsibility," Ibrahim finished firmly. "This child has been protecting herself in a cemetery for 6 months. I think she can handle the palace." He knelt again, meeting Divine's steady gaze. "Would you like to come home with me? You'll have your own room, your own bed, and you'll never have to sleep among the graves again." For the first time, something shifted in Divine's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around her eyes that suggested the possibility of hope. "Can I visit Mama and Papa?" "Whenever you want," Ibrahim promised. "But they would want you to be safe, wouldn't they? They would want you to have a chance at the life they dreamed for you." Divine nodded slowly, carefully folding the cloth she had been using to clean the headstone. She stood, brushed the dust from her torn dress, and looked up at the president with complete trust. "Okay." The presidential palace of Burkina Faso stood as a monument to the nation's aspirations, a blend of traditional African architecture and modern governmental necessity. Its walls had housed presidents and prime ministers, had echoed with the footsteps of diplomats and the heated debates of cabinet meetings, but they had never sheltered anyone quite like Divine. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a small convoy returned to the palace. Divine sat in the back seat of the presidential vehicle, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. The palace gates, imposing and guarded, opened to reveal gardens that seemed impossibly green and lush compared to the dusty cemetery where she had spent the last 6 months of her life. Palace staff had worked frantically throughout the afternoon to prepare for their unexpected guest. A room had been cleared and furnished with a child's bed, colorful curtains, and toys that seemed almost foreign after months of survival among the graves. The head of household staff, Madame Traoré, a woman whose efficiency was legendary throughout the government, had personally overseen every detail. "Where will she eat?" one staff member asked. "With the president," Madame Traoré replied firmly. "Those are his direct orders. She is to be treated not as a ward of the state, but as family." As Divine stepped out of the car, she moved with the same careful dignity that had marked her actions at the cemetery. Her bare feet touched the polished stone of the palace courtyard, and she looked up at the building that would become her new home. Several staff members had gathered to witness this unusual arrival, their faces mixing curiosity with concern. Ibrahim appeared at the main entrance, having changed from his formal presidential attire into simple civilian clothes. He approached Divine slowly, understanding that, despite her apparent calm, this transition represented a complete upheaval of everything she had known. "Are you hungry?" he asked gently. Divine nodded, though something in her expression suggested that hunger was such a constant companion that she had learned to acknowledge it without complaint. The presidential dining room was a study in understated elegance. A long mahogany table that could seat 20, crystal glasses that caught and reflected the light from an ornate chandelier, and formal place settings that spoke of diplomatic dinners and state occasions. Tonight, however, only 2 places were set, positioned at one end to create intimacy rather than formality. Divine stared at the array of silverware with obvious confusion. In her young life, meals had been simple affairs, scraps shared with her parents around their small cooking fire, and later whatever she could find or beg during her months in the cemetery. The silver spoons and multiple forks represented a complexity she had never encountered. Ibrahim noticed her hesitation and quietly moved his own place setting next to hers. "Don't worry about the fancy stuff," he said, picking up a simple spoon. "This one works for everything." The meal arrived: rice with tender beef, vegetables cooked in rich sauce, fresh bread that filled the room with its aroma. Divine's eyes widened at the abundance, but years of scarcity had taught her caution. She took small, careful bites, as if the food might disappear if she moved too quickly. "You can eat as much as you want," Ibrahim said gently. "There's more in the kitchen, and there will be breakfast tomorrow, and lunch and dinner. You don't have to save anything." It was a lesson that would take weeks to fully absorb. Scarcity had trained Divine to hoard, to ration, to never trust that the next meal would come. But gradually, as the days passed, she began to understand that security, at least the security of food and shelter, was no longer a daily concern. Her room became a sanctuary. The bed was soft beyond anything she had imagined, the sheets clean and cool. At first, she slept on the floor beside it, the mattress seeming too luxurious, too removed from the hard ground that had been her bed for months. But eventually, curiosity and comfort won out. Madame Traoré had arranged for a tutor, Professor Uedegero, a retired educator whose patience and gentle manner had made him a favorite among the children of Ouagadougou's elite families. He arrived each morning with books, paper, and the infinite patience required to work with a child whose education had been interrupted by tragedy. "She's remarkably intelligent," he reported to Ibrahim after the first week. "Her parents clearly valued education. She can read basic French and Moray, and her mathematical understanding is quite advanced for her age. But there are gaps, understandable gaps given what she's been through." The gaps weren't just in formal education. Divine moved through the palace with a hypervigilance born of months of survival. She noted every face, every voice, every change in routine. Staff members initially found her silence unsettling, this small figure who seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing of her own thoughts. But Ibrahim began to see something else in her watchfulness. During their evening meals, as he shared the challenges of his day, he noticed how carefully she listened. Her questions, when they came, were precise and penetrating. "Why did that minister disagree with you about the road project?" she asked one evening. "Sometimes people have different ideas about what's best for the country," Ibrahim explained. "But if you're the president, why don't they just do what you say?" Divine smiled. "Because good leadership means listening to different opinions, even when you don't like them." Divine considered this seriously. "But what if their opinion is wrong? What if they're lying?" The question hung in the air, more profound than perhaps even Divine realized. In her young life, truth and lies had carried life and death consequences. The villagers who called her cursed had been cruel, but they had been direct. The complexity of political maneuvering, where truth could be shaded and motivations hidden, was something entirely new. "That's why I have to pay attention," Ibrahim said finally. "I have to watch and listen and try to understand what people really mean, not just what they say." Divine nodded thoughtfully. "Like when you're hunting and you have to watch for tracks that might be fake." The analogy startled Ibrahim with its accuracy. Exactly like that. 3 weeks into Divine's residence at the palace, she had established routines that spoke to both her growing comfort and her persistent vigilance. Each morning, she would sit in the palace garden under the spreading branches of an ancient baobab tree, her schoolbook spread around her as she worked through lessons with Professor Ouedraogo. The garden had become her favorite space, open enough to see anyone approaching, but peaceful enough to think. It was from this vantage point that she first noticed the pattern that would change everything. President Ibrahim's office faced the garden, its large windows providing natural light for the endless paperwork that consumed his days. From her study spot, she had a clear view of the presidential desk and the constant stream of visitors who came and went throughout the day. She had initially paid little attention to the administrative routine, ministers arriving with briefcases, aides delivering documents, the quiet choreography of governance that kept the nation functioning. But as the days passed, her natural observational skills, honed by months of survival, began to detect irregularities in the pattern. Gerard Wagadugu had been President Traoré's personal aide for nearly 3 years. A tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually serious expression, he moved through the palace with the confidence of someone whose access to power was unquestioned. His efficiency was legendary. Documents appeared on the president's desk precisely when needed, meetings were scheduled with clockwork precision, and the administrative machinery of the presidency ran smoothly under his oversight. But Divine began to notice something troubling in Gerard's routine. Each morning, around 10 o'clock, Gerard would enter the president's office carrying a brown leather folder. The folder was always thick, always sealed, and always placed on the left side of Ibrahim's desk with ceremonial precision. The president, typically engaged in reading reports or preparing for meetings, would barely glance up as Girard announced, "The daily authorizations, Mr. President. Just need your signature." What disturbed Devine was what happened next. Without opening the folder, without reading a single document, Ibrahim would sign page after page in rapid succession. His signature, bold and confident on legislation and important state documents, became perfunctory on these daily authorizations. Sign, turn page, sign, turn page, the rhythm as mechanical as a metronome. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. Girard would collect the folder, nod respectfully, and leave. The documents would disappear into the administrative machinery of government, their contents unseen by the man whose signature gave them the force of law. At first, Devine assumed this was normal. Presidents, she reasoned, must sign thousands of documents. They couldn't possibly read everything. But her tutor's lessons echoed in her mind. Always read the question before you answer. Always understand what you're agreeing to. The contradiction troubled her. In their evening conversations, Ibrahim often spoke about the weight of presidential decisions, the careful consideration required for policies that affected millions of lives. Yet each morning, he signed documents without reading them, trusting entirely in Girard's preparation and judgment. Devine's unease grew when she began to notice other details. Girard's demeanor during these morning sessions was different from his behavior at other times. When presenting other documents, speeches, policy papers, correspondence, he was deferential, often explaining context and seeking clarification. But with the brown folder, he projected an urgency that discouraged questions, a subtle pressure that moved the president through the signing process as quickly as possible. One morning, Devine's sharp eyes caught something else. As Girard left the office with the signed documents, she saw him pause in the corridor, pull out his mobile phone, and make a brief call. The conversation was too distant to hear, but his body language suggested satisfaction, almost triumph. It was a small detail, but one that added to her growing collection of inconsistencies. Professor Ouedraogo had taught her about patterns in mathematics, in language, in nature. He said, "When you see the same thing happen repeatedly, you must ask if it's happening for a good reason or a bad one." The pattern of Girard's morning visits, Ibrahim's automatic signatures, and the aide's subsequent phone calls was becoming clear to Devine. But understanding what it meant required courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The confrontation came on a quiet Thursday evening. Ibrahim had returned from a particularly frustrating day of budget meetings, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of weariness. The national budget was under severe strain. Declining revenues from mining operations, increased security costs due to regional instability, and growing pressure from international creditors created a fiscal puzzle with no easy solutions. During dinner, Devine had listened to Ibrahim's summary of the day's challenges with her usual intense attention. She absorbed not just the content of his words, but the frustration beneath them, the weight of responsibility that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. After the meal, as was becoming their custom, they moved to Ibrahim's private study, a more intimate space than the formal presidential office, lined with books on African history, governance, and philosophy. Devine had claimed a small chair in the corner where she could observe and think while Ibrahim worked on his evening correspondence. Tonight, however, she couldn't concentrate on her schoolwork. The image of that morning's signature session played repeatedly in her mind. Girard's routine presentation, Ibrahim's mechanical signing, the brown folder disappearing into the administrative maze. The contradiction between Ibrahim's careful evening deliberations and his morning automatism had reached a point where she could no longer remain silent. "Papa," she said quietly, using the term of endearment that had emerged naturally between them. Ibrahim looked up from the speech he was reviewing, noting the unusual tension in her voice. "Yes, Divine?" She hesitated, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she was about to question. This was the president of Burkina Faso, a man whose decisions affected millions of lives, whose experience in governance far exceeded her 8 years of existence. Who was she to question his methods? But the memory of her parents' voices steadied her resolve. They had taught her that truth was more important than comfort, that asking difficult questions was sometimes an act of love rather than disrespect. "Why don't you read the papers before you sign them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. Ibrahim's pen stopped moving. He looked up, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to genuine surprise. "What papers?" "The ones Gerard brings every morning, in the brown folder. You sign them, but you don't read them first." The simplicity of the observation hit Ibrahim like a physical blow. In the complexity of presidential duties, surrounded by advisors and protocols and the endless demands of governance, this child had identified something he had stopped seeing, a routine that had become so automatic that he had ceased to question it. "I trust Gerard," Ibrahim said slowly, his voice carrying less certainty than he intended. "I review everything thoroughly. If I read every document that crosses my desk, I'd never have time for anything else." Divine nodded as if she understood, but her next question revealed the deeper concern. "But what if Gerard makes a mistake? What if someone hides something bad in those papers?" The question hung in the air between them, innocent in its phrasing, but devastating in its implications. Ibrahim set down his pen and really looked at Divine, this small person who had survived abandonment and loss, who had learned to read people and situations as a matter of survival, who was now applying those same observational skills to the world of governance. "You think Gerard might be hiding something?" he asked carefully. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "But my tutor says we should always read the instructions before we start a test. He says understanding comes before acting." She paused, her young face serious. "You're the president. What you sign matters to everyone." The words echoed in Ibrahim's mind long after Divine had gone to bed. He stood at his study window, looking out at the lights of Wagadugu, thinking about trust and responsibility, and the dangerous comfort of routine. How many documents had Ibrahim signed without reading in the past 3 years? How many decisions had he authorized based solely on Gerard's assurances? That night, for the first time in months, Ibrahim slept poorly. Divine's question had awakened something in him, not paranoia, but a healthy skepticism that had been dulled by the demands of office and the necessity of delegation. By morning, he had made a decision that would expose corruption at the highest levels of his administration and validate the wisdom of a child who had learned to see clearly because her survival had once depended on it. The next morning brought the usual choreography of presidential routine. Staff meetings, security briefings, the careful scheduling that parceled Ibrahim's day into manageable segments. But when Gerard appeared at precisely 10 o'clock with the familiar brown folder, he found a president who was no longer operating on autopilot. "The daily authorizations, Mr. President," Gerard announced with his usual professional efficiency, placing the folder on the left side of the desk and preparing to leave. "Gerard," Ibrahim said quietly, his tone carrying enough weight to stop his aide in mid-stride. "Sir, is there a problem?" "No problem," he replied, calm, but an undertone that suggested otherwise. "I've simply decided that I should be more familiar with what I'm authorizing. We'll review everything together." For just a moment, Gerard's carefully maintained facade slipped. It was barely perceptible, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely contained intake of breath, but Divine's training in reading people and situations had been passed to Ibrahim through their evening conversations. He saw the micro-expression of alarm and filed it away for consideration. "Of course, Mr. President, though I should mention that your 10:30 meeting with the agricultural minister—" "Can wait," Ibrahim finished firmly. "This is more important." They opened the folder together. The first several documents appeared routine: administrative approvals, minor budgetary adjustments, standard governmental paperwork. Gerard provided context for each, his explanations smooth and professional. But as they worked deeper into the stack, Ibrahim's trained eye began to catch inconsistencies. The fifth document made him pause. It authorized a payment of 3 billion CFA francs to a company called Tall Group for rural infrastructure development in Kurantinga province. The amount was substantial, roughly $4.5 million, but what caught Ibrahim's attention was the project description, which was unusually vague, and the company address, which he didn't recognize. "Tell me about this Tall Group project," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Gerard leaned over to examine the document, though something in his body language suggested he was buying time rather than genuinely reviewing unfamiliar information. "It's a rural infrastructure initiative. Road improvements, I believe. The details were coordinated through the Public Works Ministry." Ibrahim reached for his phone and dialed a number from memory. The conversation was brief but illuminating. "Minister Wagadugu," Ibrahim said when the call connected, "I have a payment authorization here for 3 billion CFA to something called Tall Group. Can you tell me about this project?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "Mr. President, I'm not familiar with any project of that magnitude involving a company by that name. Can you give me the authorization number? I'd like to check our records." Ibrahim read off the document number and waited. Gerard sat rigidly in his chair, his professional composure now clearly strained. "Sir," Minister Wagadugu's voice returned with obvious concern. "According to our records, no such project has been approved through this ministry. Furthermore, the signature on this authorization belongs to Deputy Minister Traoré, who resigned 4 months ago." The implications hit Ibrahim like a physical blow. He looked at Gerard, whose face had gone pale, despite his attempts to maintain composure. "Gerard," Ibrahim said quietly, "can you explain how we have an authorization signed by an official who resigned 4 months ago?" There must be some mistake," Gerard stammered. "These documents come through multiple channels. Sometimes there are administrative delays or—" "Administrative delays don't forge signatures," Ibrahim replied coldly. What followed was 3 hours of the most intensive document review of Ibrahim's presidency. With each page, the scope of the deception became clearer. Ghost companies, non-existent contractors, payments to shell corporations with no legitimate business addresses, authorizations bearing forged signatures or approvals from officials who had left government service months or even years earlier. By the time they finished, Ibrahim had identified nearly a dozen fraudulent authorizations totaling over 20 billion CFA francs, approximately $30 million that had been siphoned from the national treasury through a system of systematic deception that had operated under his signature for at least 2 years. Gerard's attempts at explanation grew increasingly desperate and contradictory. He blamed clerical errors, administrative confusion, the complexity of interministerial coordination. But each excuse crumbled under Ibrahim's methodical questioning, leaving only the stark reality of betrayal. "How long has this been going on?" Ibrahim asked finally. Gerard's silence was answer enough. That evening, as the sun set over Wagadugu, Gerard Wagadugu was quietly arrested by palace security. The charges would eventually include embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy against the state. The investigation that followed would reveal a network of corruption that reached into multiple ministries and involved millions of dollars in stolen public funds. But in the immediate aftermath, as Ibrahim sat in his study trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal, Divine knocked softly on his door. "Papa," she said, entering when he beckoned. "Are you okay?" Ibrahim looked at this small person who had lived through abandonment and loss, who had survived on the streets and among the graves, who had been cast out by her community as cursed. Now she was asking about his well-being with the same gentle concern she might show for an injured bird. "I'm okay," he said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Thanks to you." Divine climbed into the chair across from his desk, her legs too short to reach the floor. "What will happen now?" Ibrahim replied, "Now we fix what was broken, and we make sure it never happens again." "How?" Ibrahim smiled, despite the weight of the day's revelations. "By remembering to read before we sign, by asking questions, by listening to people who see things clearly." He paused. "By remembering that sometimes the most important wisdom comes from the most unexpected places." That night, as news of Gerard's arrest began to spread through the palace and beyond, Divine sat by her bedroom window looking out at the lights of the city. She thought about her parents, about the lessons they had taught her about right and wrong, about the importance of speaking truth even when it was difficult. She had asked a simple question and changed the course of a nation. But more than that, she had learned something about the power of observation, about the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly, and about the strange ways that loss and survival could prepare someone to protect others. In the days that followed, the scandal would dominate headlines across Burkina Faso and throughout West Africa. The story of a child who had exposed corruption at the highest levels of government would capture international attention and spark debates about transparency, accountability, and the unexpected sources of political wisdom. But tonight, Divine simply whispered a quiet "thank you" to her parents, turned from the window and went to sleep in the safety of her palace room, surrounded by the knowledge that truth, however small its voice, was always worth speaking. The revelation of Gerard's betrayal sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Wagadugu. Within hours of his arrest, emergency meetings convened throughout the government as ministers and officials scrambled to assess the damage to their own departments. The scale of the fraud was staggering. 20 billion CFA francs represented nearly a quarter of the annual education budget, enough to build hundreds of schools or thousands of clean water wells in rural communities. President Ibrahim called an emergency session of his cabinet for the following morning. The faces around the mahogany conference table reflected the gravity of the situation. Some showed genuine shock and concern. Others displayed the careful neutrality of officials calculating how this crisis might affect their own positions. "The investigation is ongoing," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also the fatigue of betrayal. "But what we know already is that systematic fraud has been operating at the highest levels of this administration for at least 2 years. Money that should have built roads, schools, and hospitals has been stolen through a network of ghost companies and forged authorizations." Finance Minister Rasmane Ouedraogo, a meticulous man whose reputation for honesty was unquestioned, spoke first. "Mr. President, we need to conduct a complete audit of all government contracts and payments for the past 3 years. This will require suspending some current projects while we verify their legitimacy." "Do it," Ibrahim replied, without hesitation. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. The people of Burkina Faso deserve to know that their tax money is being used for their benefit, not stolen by corrupt officials." Defense Minister Colonel Saidou Savadogo leaned forward. "Sir, we also need to consider the political implications. When this becomes public, and it will damage confidence in the government. Our enemies will use this as evidence that we're incompetent or complicit." Ibrahim nodded grimly. The colonel was right. In the volatile political environment of West Africa, corruption scandals had toppled governments and provided justification for military coups. The irony wasn't lost on him that his rise to power had come through a military intervention justified partly by the previous government's corruption. "Which is why we need to get ahead of this," Ibrahim said. "We'll hold a press conference this afternoon. Full disclosure, complete transparency. The people will know what happened, what we're doing about it, and how we plan to prevent it from happening again." The discussion that followed revealed the depth of the challenge. Gerard's access to the president had allowed him to operate with virtual impunity. His reputation for efficiency had discouraged questions, and the automatic nature of the daily signing routine had made systematic fraud not just possible, but almost inevitable. It was Minister of Justice Salomé Traoré who raised the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. "Mr. President, how did you discover this? What made you finally examine those documents after signing them automatically for so long?" Ibrahim paused, aware that his answer would sound almost impossible to believe. "A child asked me why I didn't read before I signed." The silence in the room was profound. Several ministers exchanged glances, unsure whether they had heard correctly. "A child," Justice Minister Traoré asked carefully. "Divine," Ibrahim replied simply. "The young girl who lives at the palace. She observed the morning signing routine and asked why I didn't read the documents first. It was such a simple, obvious question that I realized I didn't have a good answer." The revelation that a child had uncovered what trained government officials had missed for years would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. But as the ministers processed this information, several began to nod with understanding. Children, after all, were famous for asking the questions that adults had learned to stop asking. The press conference that afternoon was unlike any in the short history of Ibrahim's presidency. Standing before a room packed with journalists, government officials, and diplomatic representatives, he delivered what would become known as one of the most candid admissions of governmental failure in modern African politics. "My fellow citizens, I come before you today to admit that I have failed in my responsibility to protect your trust and your resources. For at least 2 years, systematic fraud has operated within this government, stealing money that belonged to you and your children." The room erupted in questions and camera flashes, but Ibrahim continued with calm determination. "The fraud was discovered not by our security services, not by our auditors, not by our ministers, but by a child who asked a simple question: why don't you read the document before you sign it?" He went on to detail the scope of the corruption, the arrests that had been made, and the comprehensive reforms that would be implemented. But it was his acknowledgement of Divine's role that dominated the headlines and captured the public imagination. "Sometimes," Ibrahim concluded, "the clearest wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. A child who has faced abandonment and hardship saw what we, in our complexity and bureaucracy, had failed to see. She reminded me that leadership requires not just trust, but verification, not just delegation, but accountability." The reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with discussions about the child who saved the treasury. International news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the narrative of an orphaned girl who had exposed high-level corruption through innocent observation. But not everyone was celebrating Divine's role in exposing the fraud. Within the government, some officials began to grumble about the influence she was gaining. The idea that a child, and a girl at that, was affecting presidential decisions challenged traditional notions of authority and hierarchy. It was Emmanuel Ouedraogo who gave voice to these concerns. Ibrahim's childhood friend had watched the press conference from his office at the Ministry of Rural Development with growing unease. The two men had grown up together in the dusty streets of Wagadugu, had shared dreams of transforming their nation, had supported each other through the dangerous early days of Ibrahim's rise to power. But Emmanuel's loyalty was being tested by what he saw as an erosion of presidential dignity. The idea that Ibrahim was taking advice from a child, that governmental decisions were being influenced by someone with no education in politics or economics, struck him as dangerous and embarrassing. 3 days after the press conference, Emmanuel requested a private meeting with his old friend. They met in Ibrahim's personal study, the same room where Divine asked her pivotal question about reading documents before signing them.
"Ibrahim," Emmanuel began without preamble, "we need to talk about this situation with the girl." "Her name is Divine," Ibrahim replied quietly. "And what situation?" "The situation where you're allowing a child to influence presidential decisions. The situation where you're publicly crediting an 8-year-old with discovering corruption that should have been caught by trained professionals. The situation where you're undermining the dignity of your office by suggesting that a little girl knows better than your advisors." Ibrahim studied his friend's face, seeing frustration and genuine concern, but also something else. A wounded pride that came from being upstaged by someone society deemed unqualified to have opinions about governance. "Divine didn't discover the corruption," Ibrahim corrected gently. "She asked a question that led me to discover it myself. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because the way you tell it, and the way the media is reporting it, this child is some kind of mystical advisor who sees what the rest of us can't. It's embarrassing, Ibrahim. It makes us all look incompetent." "Maybe that's because we were incompetent. For 2 years, 20 billion CFA francs was stolen right under our noses. Our systems failed. Our oversight failed. Our trust was betrayed. A child's question exposed that failure not because she's mystical, but because she wasn't blinded by our assumptions and routines." Emmanuel stood and began pacing, his agitation evident. "You're missing the point. This isn't about whether she was right or wrong. It's about perception. It's about leadership. How can you govern effectively if people think you need a child to help you make decisions?" "I don't need Divine to help me make decisions, but I value her perspective because she sees things clearly. She doesn't have political motivations. She doesn't have hidden agendas. She asks honest questions and makes honest observations. She's 8 years old." "Yes," Ibrahim agreed, "and sometimes that's exactly what we need, someone who hasn't learned to stop asking the obvious questions." The conversation continued for another hour, growing more heated as Emmanuel's frustration spilled out. He spoke about traditions of governance, about the importance of maintaining presidential authority, about the dangers of appearing weak or indecisive. Ibrahim listened patiently, understanding that his friend's concerns came from genuine care for both him personally and the stability of the government. But when Emmanuel finally left, Ibrahim felt a distance between them that hadn't existed before. The corruption scandal had revealed more than financial fraud. It had exposed different philosophies about leadership, transparency,
and the sources of wisdom. As Divine's profile grew, so did the attention she attracted, and not all of it was positive. The story of the orphaned girl who had exposed government corruption captured international headlines, but it also made her a target for those who preferred the shadows of accountability. Within a week of the press conference, threatening letters began arriving at the palace. Most were anonymous, filled with crude warnings about cursed children and unnatural influences. Palace security dismissed most as the ravings of cranks and conspiracy theorists, but some carried a sophistication that suggested more organized opposition. Divine seemed largely unaware of the threats swirling around her. She continued her daily routine: morning lessons with Professor Ouedraogo, quiet observation of palace life, evening conversations with Ibrahim. But those who knew her well began to notice subtle changes. She stayed closer to familiar areas of the palace, rarely venturing into the gardens alone. Her hypervigilance, which had begun to relax during her first months at the palace, returned with renewed intensity. It was Madame Traoré, the head of household staff, who first voiced concerns about Divine's safety. During a security briefing, she reported that several staff members had noticed strangers asking questions about Divine's routines, her movements, her relationship with the president. "It doesn't feel like normal media interest," Madame Traoré reported. Captain Wagadugu took these reports seriously. Palace security was increased, and Divine was assigned a discreet protection detail. Guards who maintained distance but ensured she was never truly alone in potentially vulnerable situations. The first direct threat came on a quiet Tuesday evening. Divine had gone to the palace garden to retrieve a notebook she had left on her favorite stone bench beneath the baobab tree. The garden at night was peaceful, lit by soft pathway lights that created pools of gentle illumination among the carefully tended flower beds. As she approached the bench, her peripheral vision caught movement near the tea service area where Ibrahim often took his morning coffee. Two figures in dark clothing were crouched beside the small table, their movements furtive and purposeful. Every instinct honed by months of survival kicked in. Instead of calling out or approaching, Divine immediately retreated into the shadows, her heart pounding as she watched the figures work. One appeared to be placing something into the ceramic sugar bowl that accompanied Ibrahim's morning tea service, while the other kept watch. For a moment, Divine froze with the terrible understanding of what she was witnessing. These weren't palace staff performing routine maintenance. These were intruders tampering with something Ibrahim consumed daily. The implications were clear and terrifying. Her scream shattered the garden's tranquility. "Guards! Guards! Help!" The response was immediate. Security personnel appeared from seemingly nowhere, their training kicking in as they converged on the threat. The two intruders attempted to flee, one leaping over a low hedge toward the palace perimeter, the other trying to reach the cover of the administrative wing. Both were apprehended within minutes. The interrogation that followed revealed a plot that chilled everyone involved. The men were not palace staff, but hired killers who had been paid to poison Ibrahim's morning tea. The substance they had intended to use was a slow-acting toxin that would have caused what appeared to be a heart attack within hours of consumption. Under pressure, one of the assassins revealed their employer, a high-ranking government official who had been implicated in the corruption scandal and feared that further investigation would expose his own involvement. The same official had recruited Emmanuel, playing on his growing resentment about Divine's influence and his fear that Ibrahim was losing his political edge. The revelation that Emmanuel, Ibrahim's childhood friend and trusted ally, had been involved in a plot to kill him was devastating. But even more shocking was the realization that Divine had once again saved his life through her observation and quick thinking. The arrests made headlines across West Africa. The story of the child who had first exposed corruption and then foiled an assassination attempt captured the imagination of a continent where political betrayal and violence were all too common. Divine became a symbol not just of innocence speaking truth to power, but of vigilance protecting the vulnerable. The attempted poisoning fundamentally changed Divine's status within the palace and the nation. What had begun as a story of an observant child asking good questions had evolved into something far more complex, a narrative about protection, intuition, and the mysterious ways that the powerless sometimes shield the powerful. Ibrahim's public response to the assassination attempt was carefully measured. Standing before cameras in the same palace garden where the plot had been foiled, with Divine at his side, he spoke with quiet intensity about betrayal, vigilance, and the price of reform. "The enemies of transparency and accountability have shown their true nature," he said. "When exposed to light, they resort to darkness. When challenged by questions, they respond with violence, but they have underestimated the power of truth and the courage of those who speak it." He placed a gentle hand on Divine's shoulder. "This child has now saved not just our nation's treasury, but perhaps our nation's future. She has shown that protection comes not from weapons or walls, but from awareness, from caring enough to pay attention, from having the courage to act when action is needed." The speech was broadcast live across Burkina Faso and throughout the region. But its impact went beyond policy or politics. It elevated Divine from a human interest story to something approaching a national symbol. The transformation brought both protection and peril. Public support for Divine was overwhelming. Mothers in villages across the country spoke of her as an example to their daughters. School children drew pictures of the brave girl who lived in the palace. Market vendors sold cloth printed with her image alongside traditional African symbols of wisdom and protection. But symbols, especially powerful ones, attract both devotion and resentment. Within the palace, some officials who had initially dismissed Divine as a curiosity now regarded her with barely concealed hostility. Her presence in high-level meetings, her quiet questions that exposed inconsistencies, her obvious influence on presidential thinking, all of this challenged traditional hierarchies and made some people deeply uncomfortable. The rumors began subtly, but spread with the persistence of wildfire. Divine wasn't normal, people whispered. No ordinary child could see so much, understand so much, prevent so much harm. Some claimed she was blessed by ancestral spirits. Others suggested darker possibilities, that she was cursed, that her survival when her parents died proved supernatural involvement, that her presence brought danger to those around her. Professor Ouedraogo, who spent hours with Divine each day, became increasingly concerned about the psychological pressure she was under. During their lessons, he noticed signs of stress that no 8-year-old should have to carry. "She's remarkably resilient," he reported to Ibrahim during one of their regular consultations, "but she's also hyper-aware of everything around her in ways that aren't entirely healthy. She watches constantly, analyzes constantly, worries constantly about threats that might emerge. The weight of being seen as a protector is enormous for someone so young." Ibrahim understood the concern. He had watched Divine's natural childhood curiosity evolve into something more intense and vigilant. The playfulness that had begun to emerge during her first months at the palace had been replaced by a seriousness that seemed far too mature for her age. Yet he also recognized that Divine's hypervigilance wasn't entirely imposed from outside. It was partly a survival mechanism that had kept her alive during months of abandonment, and partly a natural response to the very real threats that surrounded her new life. The challenge was helping her find balance between necessary caution and the freedom to simply be a child. The solution came from an unexpected source. During one of their evening conversations, Divine mentioned missing the quiet of the cemetery where she had lived after her parents' death. "It was peaceful there," she said. "Everyone was already gone, so you didn't have to worry about them getting hurt." The comment revealed the burden Divine carried. Not just fear for her own safety, but responsibility for protecting those around her. She had begun to see herself as a guardian whose vigilance stood between Ibrahim and various threats, a role that was both empowering and exhausting for someone so young. "Divine," Ibrahim said gently, "you know it's not your job to protect me, right? That's what security guards are for." "But I see things they don't see," Divine replied with matter-of-fact honesty. "And if I don't watch, bad things happen." Ibrahim realized then that Divine's transformation from abandoned child to palace protector had created its own kind of prism. She had gained safety and purpose, but at the cost of the carefree innocence that should have been her right as a child. The ultimate test of Divine's wisdom and courage came 6 months after the assassination attempt, when the shadows of political conspiracy reached their deepest point. Emmanuel, awaiting trial for his role in the poisoning plot, had become a focal point for opposition to Ibrahim's government. From his prison cell, he maintained his innocence and claimed that Ibrahim had been manipulated by supernatural forces that threatened the natural order of governance. These claims found resonance among certain segments of society. Traditional leaders who were uncomfortable with a child wielding influence, political opponents who saw an opportunity to undermine Ibrahim's authority, and religious figures who viewed Divine's prominence as a challenge to established hierarchies.
The opposition coalesced around a narrative that was both simple and dangerous. Ibrahim Traoré had fallen under the spell of a cursed child, and the nation suffered as a result. Protests began in remote provinces, small at first but growing in size and intensity. Banners appeared, demanding Divine's removal from the palace. Radio programs debated whether the president was still capable of independent thought. The crisis came to a head during a cabinet meeting focused on responding to growing civil unrest in the northern provinces. As ministers debated security measures and political responses, Divine sat in her usual place at the edge of the room, quietly observing and occasionally taking notes in her ever-present notebook. Defense Minister Wagadugu was presenting options for dealing with the protests when he made a comment that changed the entire dynamic of the discussion. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should consider whether the continued presence of the child is worth the political cost. The unrest is directly connected to public concerns about her influence. If we addressed those concerns, we might be able to restore stability more easily." The room fell silent. Several ministers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded slightly in agreement. It was the first time anyone had directly suggested that Divine's presence at the palace was a liability rather than an asset. Ibrahim's response was immediate and decisive. "Minister Wagadugu, are you suggesting that we should banish a child from her home because some people find her existence inconvenient?" "I'm suggesting that we consider all options for restoring national unity," Wagadugu replied carefully. "The girl has served her purpose. She exposed corruption. She prevented an assassination. But her continued prominence is dividing the country. Sometimes leadership requires difficult sacrifices." Before Ibrahim could respond, Divine spoke from her corner of the room. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the space. "Minister Wagadugu, can you tell me why the reports from Kuritenga province show different casualty numbers in the morning briefing than in the afternoon update?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, unrelated to the discussion about her own future. Wagadugu looked confused and slightly irritated. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said dismissively. "We're discussing serious matters of state, not—" Divine continued with the same quiet persistence. "The morning report said 12 civilians were injured in the protests, but the afternoon report said 8. People don't usually get uninjured. So either the morning report was wrong, or the afternoon report is wrong, or someone is changing numbers." Minister of Interior Kabori quickly pulled out his briefing documents and began comparing the reports Divine had referenced. His face grew troubled as he read. "She's right," he said slowly. "The numbers don't match. And there are other inconsistencies, different locations for some incidents, different descriptions of the same events." What followed was 2 hours of the most intensive fact-checking of Ibrahim's presidency. Under Divine's quiet questioning and the scrutiny it prompted, a pattern emerged that revealed systematic manipulation of intelligence reports. Casualty figures were being adjusted downward, the severity of incidents was being minimized, and the geographic spread of the unrest was being understated. The source of the manipulation became clear when cross-referencing revealed that all the altered reports had passed through Minister Savadogo's office for security review before reaching the president. The betrayal was different from Gerard's financial fraud or Emmanuel's assassination plot, but no less serious. By manipulating intelligence reports, Savadogo had prevented Ibrahim from understanding the true scope of the crisis facing the nation. Decisions about resource allocation, security deployments, and political responses had all been based on incomplete or false information. When confronted with the evidence, Savadogo's defense crumbled quickly. The manipulation hadn't been motivated by personal financial gain, but by a desire to maintain his reputation as an effective security minister. Admitting the full scope of the unrest would have been admitting failure in his primary responsibility. But the revelation had broader implications. Divine's question had once again exposed systemic deception at the highest levels of government, and she had done it not through mystical insight or supernatural awareness, but through careful observation and the simple expectation that official reports should be consistent and truthful. As Savadogo was led away under arrest, Ibrahim looked around the cabinet room at the faces of his remaining ministers. Some showed shock and concern. Others displayed the careful neutrality of people calculating how this latest crisis might affect their own positions. "Does anyone else have questions about Divine's continued presence in this palace?" Ibrahim asked quietly. The silence that followed was profound and lasting. In the months that followed Minister Savadogo's arrest, a remarkable transformation occurred within the government of Burkina Faso. The systematic exposure of corruption and deception had initially seemed like evidence of institutional failure, but it gradually became something else, a demonstration of institutional healing. Divine's role evolved from that of an inadvertent corruption detector to something more deliberate and structured. Ibrahim formally appointed her as Special Advisor on Integrity and Transparency, a position that had no precedent in African governance, but which reflected the unique value she brought to the administration. The appointment was not without controversy. Opposition leaders ridiculed the idea of a child holding an official government position. International observers questioned whether such an arrangement could be sustainable or appropriate. Even some supporters worried that formalizing Divine's role might place too much pressure on someone so young. But the results spoke for themselves. Government meetings that had once been perfunctory exercises in bureaucratic routine became careful examinations of policy and procedure. Ministers arrived prepared not just with recommendations, but with evidence to support their proposals. The automatic deference that had previously greeted presidential authority was replaced by a culture of respectful but thorough scrutiny. Divine's methods remained simple and consistent. She asked questions that exposed inconsistencies. She noticed patterns that revealed problems. She insisted on clarity where others might accept confusion. Her notebook, ever present and constantly growing, became a symbol of accountability that influenced behavior throughout the government. Professor Drogo, who continued to serve as her tutor, marveled at the evolution he witnessed.
She's developed an intuitive understanding of how complex systems can be manipulated, he reported to Ibrahim. But more than that, she's learned to ask the kinds of questions that prevent manipulation from taking root. The international attention continued to grow. Divine's story was featured in documentaries, academic studies, and news reports around the world. The narrative of an orphan child who had become a guardian of governmental integrity resonated across cultures and continents. But perhaps the most significant change was in Divine herself. The hypervigilance that had marked her early months at the palace gradually evolved into something more balanced. She remained observant and careful, but the desperate edge of someone fighting for survival had softened into the confident awareness of someone who understood her own value and purpose. One evening, nearly a year after her arrival at the palace, Divine and Ibrahim were having their customary post-dinner conversation in his study. The day had been typical of their new routine. Meetings where her questions had improved decision-making, briefings where her observations had prevented potential problems, moments where her presence had simply reminded everyone to think more carefully about their responsibilities. "Do you ever miss the cemetery?" Ibrahim asked, curious about how she viewed her transformation from abandoned child to governmental advisor. Divine considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "it was quiet there, simple. You knew where the dangers were because they were obvious: cold, hunger, people who might hurt you." She paused, looking out the window at the lights of Wagadugu. "Here, the dangers are hidden. People smile when they're planning bad things. They say nice words when they mean something else. It's harder to see." "But you do see," Ibrahim observed. "Sometimes," Divine agreed. "But it's tiring to always watch, always listen, always wonder if someone is lying." Ibrahim understood. The burden of constant vigilance was one he knew well from his own experiences in politics and military service. The difference was that he had chosen this life while Divine was thrust into it by circumstances beyond her control. "You know," he said gently, "you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. There are other people who can watch and listen and ask questions." Divine smiled, one of her rare, genuine smiles that reminded Ibrahim that despite everything she had experienced and everything she had become, she was still fundamentally a child. "Yes, I know," she said, "but Mama and Papa taught me that if you can help people, you should help people. And this is how I can help." The simple statement encapsulated everything Divine had become and everything she represented. She had not sought power or influence. She had not asked to become a symbol or a guardian. But when presented with the opportunity to use her abilities to protect others and serve the greater good, she had accepted that responsibility with the same quiet dignity she had shown while caring for her parents' grave. 2 years after Divine first asked why President Traoré didn't read documents before signing them, Burkina Faso had become a case study in governmental transparency and accountability. The reforms implemented in response to the corruption scandals had created new oversight mechanisms, improved financial controls, and established a culture where questioning authority was seen as patriotic rather than subversive. Divine's influence extended far beyond the presidential palace. Schools across the nation began teaching critical observation as a formal subject, encouraging students to ask the kinds of questions that revealed truth and prevented deception. Government transparency became a source of national pride rather than a bureaucratic burden. The girl who had once been called cursed by her village was now celebrated as a national treasure. But those who knew her best understood that her true gift was not supernatural insight or mystical wisdom. It was simply the courage to see clearly and speak truthfully in a world that often preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. On quiet evenings, when the demands of state business had been set aside and the palace had settled into peaceful routine, Divine would still sometimes sit by her window and whisper words of gratitude to her parents. They had taught her about right and wrong, about the importance of caring for others, about the responsibility that comes with being able to see what others might miss. She had kept their lessons alive not just in memory, but in action. In asking simple questions and refusing to accept inadequate answers, she had helped transform a nation. In watching carefully and speaking truthfully, she had protected those who might otherwise have fallen victim to corruption and betrayal. President Ibrahim Traoré, in his evening reflections, often returned to the moment when Divine had first asked her pivotal question about reading before signing. It had seemed so simple then, a child's innocent curiosity about adult routines. But it had proven to be one of the most important questions in the history of his presidency, perhaps in the modern history of Burkina Faso. The story of Divine and the president became more than a tale of personal transformation or political reform. It became a reminder that wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected places, that truth-telling was its own form of courage, and that sometimes the most powerful force for change was simply someone who cared enough to pay attention and brave enough to ask why. In the heart of West Africa, in a palace where power met accountability, and where a child's questions had changed the course of a nation, the light of integrity continued to shine. It was not a mystical light or a supernatural glow, but something far more powerful and enduring. The light of truth, carefully tended and fearlessly shared, illuminating the path towards a more just and honest world. The cemetery, where Divine had once lived among the graves, now bore a small memorial, not to the dead, but to the living reminder that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from those who have learned to survive by seeing clearly, speaking truthfully, and never stopping to ask the questions that others have forgotten to voice. In the end, Divine's greatest gift to Burkina Faso was not the corruption she exposed or the conspiracies she foiled, but the culture of inquiry she inspired, a lasting legacy that would continue to protect and serve long after her own story had become the stuff of history and hope.